Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Mary Papazian, Executive Vice President of the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges. Mary's had a long and distinguished career in higher ed on both sides of the governance fence, having served as president at San Jose State University and Southern Connecticut State University, as well as board chair at the Business Higher Ed Education Forum, Coalition for Urban Serving Universities, and the Mountain West Athletic Conferences. Mary joins us today to talk about higher education governance and AGB's recent statement on influences impacting governing board independence and leadership, which is only the 13th such statement they've issued in their 110-year history. Mary, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Drumm. Good to see you.
You too as well, and we've got the opportunity to talk a lot today, and actually this is going to be a really good precursor for the new year, as well as I will probably get a chance to see you back in Boston at the AGB Global Leadership Conference.
Yeah, our National Conference on Trusteeship, which will be taking place in Boston, as well as our Conference for Board Professionals, a very important role, will happen in Boston at the end of March. And I couldn't be more excited, and I look forward to seeing you in person.
Absolutely. So let's kick this thing off, because you and I are both passionate about governance, and especially board governance in higher ed. But before we jump into it and this report that AGB just released, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get to this position, and why are you passionate about governance?
Well, it's a great question. I've only been in this role at AGB as the executive vice president since the end of August, so really the latter half of this year. But I've come to believe over the course of a 35-plus year career in higher education that governance at the board level is critical for ensuring that institutions run well, that they are addressing the current needs, that they're supportive of the president. And I served in my career in higher education. I'm an old English professor, Drumm. I'll just start with that. And so I come at it from the faculty side, from the researching side, writing articles and books on my field of Renaissance literature. But then I moved into the academic administrative side, and I served as a associate dean, as a provost, and then president at Southern Connecticut State University and at San Jose State University more recently. And in these latter roles especially, I really came to see that relationship between the board and the president and senior leadership as critical to the health and well-being of an institution. And so as I thought about what I might do next, the opportunity to work at AGB, really the gold standard on governance in higher education, is a real honor and privilege. And I hope I can make a small contribution to the work that we're doing today.
Well, I'm sure you will, especially with your background. I mean, when I think of AGB, of course, full disclosure, I'm a senior consultant for AGB, as well as having my own business. And in some areas, we're very complementary, and in others, we compete a little bit, and that's perfectly fine. But having said that, AGB does incredible work for universities, colleges, especially around governance, foundations, recruiting of, what is it? It's recruiting, but it's, the presidential search. There we go. Having one of those senior moments. As I'm getting a little older here, I probably shouldn't say that, but
no,
well.
Not at all. Not at all.
So, but the board's responsibilities nowadays have gotten to be so broad. And I was talking with one person the other day. It's like you're trying to fit a camel through the eye of a needle with some of the challenges that boards are facing right now because of the divided times we live in. I mean, Put this in perspective for us, because it's not easy times, and the role of the board is far more challenging than it's ever been.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I should add that particularly in the latter part of my career while I served as president, I also became very active in volunteer boards in the higher education space, but also in that intersection between business and higher education. So things like urban serving universities or the Business Higher Ed Forum or the NCAA, which has its share of news to make, it seems, every day, doesn't it?
Really? I just hadn't heard. I must be living under a rock.
Yeah, how about that? And I sit actually as a trustee on a small liberal arts college halfway around the world called Papazian College. So seeing it really from both sides of the fence. And I would say this, that boards are the essential element, I think, for the success of institutions. And they're not the only one. They're necessary, but not sufficient. But their key responsibility is to provide that leadership, that strategic leadership and that commitment to mission, and then also to hire and support the institutional CEO, the president or chancellor. In the case of higher ed institutions, in the case of institutionally related foundations, it might be the executive director. And we work with both as members at AGB. And so it's a really critical role. The key here, though, is that boards hire presidents who have leadership teams. So one of the key elements that we at AGB really work with our trustees, our board representatives and members, is to understand the role that boards should play in governance and the role that presidents should play in management and leadership for the institution. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the key differential. And when boards and presidents get that balance right, they're usually well positioned to address challenges. And as you said, we have many challenges today of a variety of kinds that seem to put boards in the news on a regular basis. I have never seen the question of board governance more popular with our mainstream media than we're seeing it today.
Oh, no kidding. I mean, just in the last 3 weeks, we've seen, Florida always comes to mind. Texas is coming to mind, but now we've got Ohio at Youngstown State and other institutions as well. It's really challenging. But, this isn't the first time we've faced these divided times. I mean, you and I both lived through the 60s in Vietnam, George Floyd, the pandemic. It's a lot of, we see this. I'm still amazed, but it's not the first time.
It's not the first time that there's been divisions in our country. I mean, we did fight a civil war back in the 19th century, so we have seen things reach very, very divisive levels. We went through the Red Scare, the McCarthy years, which certainly put many faculty in the crosshairs of McCarthy's Inquisition, if you will. And we've seen more recently, as you said, in our own lifetimes, the challenges around Vietnam, the various divisions between faculty and administrators, and then most recently, really approaches to addressing the pandemic, something that we didn't entirely understand. And so we were learning as we were experiencing it and making policies. And I happened to be a president during the pandemic. And I can tell you, and my colleagues as well, spending every day trying to understand what we should be doing next and making sure that we're keeping board members in the loop, particularly board chairs, so they understand why we're taking the approach that we're taking. And then, of course, the social unrest during the summer when George Floyd was murdered and what that brought to the surface. And again, today, we're facing it with issues that are divisive. There have been certainly surveys that show that our country is probably more divided today than it's been for a long time. But the key is this, that good governance is what I like to call evergreen. If a board has developed the muscles of good governance, the board will be able to address in a way that supports that institution and navigate those choppy waters. Because it's not if a crisis is going to come or if unrest is going to come or if challenge is going to come. It's what will it look like? How will it affect your institution? How will it affect your institution in ways that might differ from how it affects another institution? what might be the implications. And so at AGB, we're really committed to helping our members. And we've got over 2,000 member institutions, which represents about 40,000 member trustees. So we work to really help build those good governance muscles before there's a crisis. But then we also, through our consulting arm and other areas, provide in-time support to institutions when they're going through a crisis. So it's a combination of building the knowledge, building the muscles, but also being there in real time to support institutions as they navigate difficult circumstances.
Mm-hmm. So AGB just released this report. It's actually a statement on the entitled Influences Impacting Governing Board Independence and Leadership. AGB doesn't issue all these many. I mean, you just referred back to the academic freedom. A previous guest I had on a few weeks back, we talked about AAUP's special report. This isn't quite at the same level as that, but AGB doesn't issue these all that often. It's an evergreen statement.
Yeah, and that was the intention of it. The AAUP report was a specific report looking at a specific analysis through the lens and the principles that AAUP has. What we've done as AGB, I would say since 2010, our board, and these are statements issued by the AGB Board of Directors, and they have issued, I want to say, 13 statements. So it's on average about one a year and a half. And it really is to provide best practices and strategies for our institutional members so that as they face issues that have risen in perhaps consciousness at that particular time, it's a way for our board to provide that kind of guidance to members. And so this statement is actually a update of a similar statement that we issued in 2012. Because, again, the principles of board autonomy, of the citizen trustee, honoring their fiduciary responsibilities, and that's the duties of care, which is where, as a trustee, you focus on the best interest of the enterprise, right? That's your touchstone duty.
One would hope.
Well, that's what good governance represents, right? And loyalty, where you place the interest of the enterprise ahead of the interest of yourself or any other individual person. And obedience, the duty of obedience, which is where you ensure that the enterprise is operating according to its stated purpose, to its mission, and to its governing documents. So these are core responsibilities of boards, and they really, I think, provide the foundation for ensuring that boards have autonomy to make decisions in the best interest of the institution. And so that's really what this statement defines, provides some guidance for, and recognizes that sometimes the trustees or boards might be challenged in a variety of ways to actually uphold those duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. And we want to give tools to these boards to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's unpack those 4 principles just a little bit. The first, I'll just kind of read through them. Preserve institutional independence and autonomy. Demonstrate board independence to govern as established in charter, state law, constitution. Keep academic freedom central and be the standard bearer for the due process protection of faculty, staff, and students. And assure institutional accountability to the public interest. In your new statement, I thought it was really interesting because you're basing a lot of stuff on the foundation of academic freedom. And I'll quote, without academic freedom and autonomy, higher education institutions cannot fulfill the vital role they play in our democracy and economy. The global competitive positions of our nature and society are in jeopardy if board oversight of academic freedom is diluted. That's pretty powerful.
Well, we strongly believe at AGB that higher education here in the United States is the envy of the world for a reason. Mm-hmm. And really at its core is this commitment to academic freedom, which means that faculty are able to pursue answers to questions without influence by outside voices. They could study a topic, for example, and reach a conclusion that might not meet the approval of somebody or another, because they put the principles of good research, of really addressing a question at the fore. And so it's important to have those spaces where this kind of work, teaching, learning, research, service, the kinds of projects can happen. And higher education in the United States is the envy of the world, in part because of this autonomy and because of this commitment to academic freedom as central to its nature. We are also a democracy that cares deeply about, the citizen voice, and our trustees are actually citizen trustees. They may be appointed, if they're public board members, through a political process. If they're private board members, they are probably appointed by other members of the board. They could be alumni, friends, and the like. But ultimately, when they come together as board members, their focus now is on addressing the needs of the institution itself and protecting its independence so that it can develop and meet its mission in the way it deems best.
Yeah, I would challenge you just a little bit on that citizen trustees, because we're seeing so much more politicalization of higher ed, and trustees, especially public institutions, being appointed by governors, by legislatures, and there is a mixed perception of what their duty is. In fact, Governor DeSantis had his attorney general file a lawsuit about accreditation, and the lawsuit says that state governments are the owner of state institutions, and that as creatures of the state, these schools are responsible to the state legislature, the state government. So if the legislature or state government directs that these schools should act in a particular way, they should not be prohibited from doing so. That puts your trustees more as agents of the state than it does citizen trustees.
That is what the governor of Florida has said, but I would venture here that, and I served, by the way, I should add that I spent my entire career in public institutions in 5 states. So I'm very familiar with the public process, and it's true in the public institutions as opposed to the private institutions. The appointing process is generally, for most trustees, through a political representation. So where I most recently was in California, the appointing recommendor is the governor, who sends the names then to the legislature, where they actually have confirmation hearings, and then they're appointed. So there is absolutely a public accountability piece for public boards. There's no question about it. But we still believe strongly in the fiduciary duties of that board member. So however they are then appointed, right, and the public side, unless you're an alumni member or a student member, perhaps there might be a slightly different process. Most of them do come through an appointing process that comes out of the political realm. And that's because it is a public trust. It is a public entity. And so these trustees then, they aren't there to do the work of the legislature or the governor. They're there to serve their fiduciary responsibility to the institution. So they may be informed by that public context, but their responsibility is to the institution itself. And that's a core principle for us at AGB as part of what good governance looks like. And there's not unusual for there to be push me, pull me, efforts. Most politicians do like to have more control. And it's really the responsibility ultimately of the trustees. So that's what good governance looks like. Not all governance is perhaps modeling good governance, but we believe that ultimately the institution is stronger when the board members actually exercise those fiduciary responsibilities. And that is really what a citizen trustee looks like.
Well, I would agree with you 100%. And then I would also say, well, there's the truth and the reality of the situation. And unfortunately, we're seeing way more reality than we are seeing the idealistic truth.
Well, I don't think it's an idealistic truth, Drumm. I think it's a good governance truth, which is an idealism. And in all circumstances, you don't expect 100% everything to be at the perfect representation of what best practices are. That's never true in any situation. And
Really?
so there will always be, I think, it's not unusual for there to be different leaders in different roles who might want to test the limits of things. That's human nature, isn't it? But ultimately, we hope that by actually working with trustees, and there's a lot of turnover on trustees. On average, 1 to 2 years, you'll see turnover, really to build those muscles of what good governance looks like, so that when those kinds of challenges come, that trustees have a way to respond. And in some cases, they'll be able to do it effectively. In other cases, it might be more of a challenge. But ultimately, I think it's in the long-term interest of the institution to maintain those good governance principles. So we need a little idealism always. We need to have a North Star. And sometimes we wade off course slightly, but hopefully if we don't have a North Star, we can't pull ourselves back to the right course.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with that. That North Star to me is good governance, adherence to fiduciary duties and focusing on the mission of the school. If you're not doing those two things, then something's wrong.
No, absolutely. And that's why I think, again, it's the role of the board ultimately to establish that mission and to reaffirm that mission. Not in an isolated way, but in conversation with all stakeholders and constituents, both within the institution and outside the institution, right? Because mission and the way we implement mission or actually fulfill mission will evolve and change because our world is not a static world. The needs are not static needs. And we know that today. We're not only living in a time of great divisiveness, but we're also living in a time of a real paradigm shift. What I like to call that change from the industrial model to the knowledge-based digital model. We are all familiar, right, with ChatGPT and generative AI and how it's changing the way we learn, work, the whole thing, and live. And so there are many pressures of various kinds. And our boards, the more they are able to really articulate that mission so that it is both evergreen but also responsive to changing needs, again, the greater clarity and leadership they'll be able to give to their institutions.
Spot on. And we've talked about this before, the way that these boards need to behave, listen and hear, applying these diverse views to what's best for the institution, things along those lines.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And this is true if you're a public board or a private board of a higher ed institution or an institutionally related foundation. And again, all of those are our member institutions. And no institution lives, there's that old model, right? The city on a hill, the ivory tower, the institution completely out somewhere where it's not connected to its surroundings. That really isn't the case. And we see institutions are very much a part of their communities. And it's important, and there are many stakeholders in many different sectors who have an interest in that institution. They could be alumni, they could be donors and friends, they could be, elected officials, they could be community leaders from the nonprofit sector, from the business community, as well as students and faculty and staff and prospective students and the K through 12 system, right? That is looking to prepare and to educate students who will then, one hopes, move on to one of the higher education institutions. So all of these voices are important. It can sound sometimes like a cacophony of noise, but I think it's really important for board members to be able to listen deeply and to discern what is really informing the decisions they might have to make, but ultimately, not just listen to the loudest voice out there. And we all know in a time of social media, voices can be amplified to great levels, right? To very high decibels. that doesn't necessarily mean that is the best advice for that institution. It could be the quiet voice that one has to listen to. So it really is for the board members coming together as a collective board. So each board member brings her or his own perspective, experience, and the like to that boardroom. We encourage this kind of diversity of viewpoint and experience. It enriches the conversation. It ensures, if you have robust conversations within the boardroom, that the right decisions can be made, but ultimately the board acts as a single entity. So you bring the individual voices, but ultimately you talk it through based on all that input and what you've heard and what your own experience tells you. And then the board makes a decision of whatever it might be, and then they act as one.
I really liked the recommendations that came out of the study. While these 4 principles are still bedrock, governing boards need fresh guidance on how to apply them currently. Engage in thoughtful discussion, decision-making, and policy-making to build shared understanding of the core concepts and values that underlie exemplary governance in the board's work, while continuing to have meaningful learning experiences together about foundational principles, not just current campus matters. I like that because it's a broader statement. It's saying you've got to do your duties, but you also need to listen to other folks outside of the campus and be able to set the direction going forward.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And I would say this isn't a report so much as it's a statement of good governance. This didn't look to take any specific incident or example, which you mentioned early on in the podcast, and analyze it. It really looks at what kind of evergreen good guidance can we give our board members so that they can then take those lessons, if you will, and take those strategies, take those recommendations like the one you just described, thoughtful discussion, decision-making, and policy-making to build a shared understanding of core concepts. This is really critical, and what we're hoping to do is provide those tools to board members so that they know how to, and they have a better, if you will, perspective on how they can navigate all of these differing voices and pressures. When they're in the boardroom, it's just they're in the boardroom and they have that responsibility. And so what we try to do at AGB is really articulate what those best practices are in governance, but then also provide toolkits and strategies and hands-on approaches to applying, if you will, those best practices. How do we apply them to make a difference in the best interests of our institution, in our own context, with our own pressures, our own culture, and the like?
And when we talk about, and I'm going to bring up a slightly divisive term, depending on where you are, diversity. Many folks are going against, DEI initiatives, et cetera. But from my own perspective, and I think from yours as well, diversity is not about race. It's not about ethnic. It's about diversity of thought. And our own thoughts come out of our own life experiences, et cetera. So bringing those different perspectives into the boardroom, to me, is critical.
Well, I think the reality is, and without getting into some of the larger political issues around diversity.
Yeah, let's not go there.
But I think the point is an important one, which is that we know well that better decisions are made when there is a diversity of viewpoints around the table. This is true everywhere and in all circumstances. Otherwise, you get into a kind of groupthink where everybody, you have blind spots. And the way to address blind spots or try to anticipate blind spots or catch blind spots is when you have diversity of viewpoints, because lived experiences and the like will have people bring and see different things. Again, that is about bringing those voices and making sure that all those voices can be heard. When we start shutting out voices and not bringing in and really, I think, striving for as diverse a collection of viewpoints as we can, then we are setting ourselves up for missing something important. Nothing's 100%, but it certainly helps us along the way.
We just finished working with a client who had some issues around board governance and shared governance. And when you take a look it's been going on. They just, a new president on board. The old president had been there for 20 plus years. The board had listened exclusively to the president as he systematically broke down shared governance. And they're back on the right track at this point, but they got away from listening to the diversity of thought.
Yeah, and that happens. And again, these things happen in most organizations at some point. And then what you want, again, if we can provide that North Star of good guidance, one of the things we encourage our boards to do, for example, is to do a board assessment, a regular kind of self-assessment. And it articulates some of these principles and asks the board members to really evaluate how they're performing in their own eyes against some of these benchmarks. And that can be a really healthy process for boards to do. We encourage boards to do it, honestly, in times when you're not facing a crisis. The best time to kind of build good governance muscles is when you're not in crisis, because then you can actually reflect and you can talk it through and you can reassert the values that will enable your work to be more effective.
Yeah. This is something that I've done with you at AGB, that you have other folks do, but it's something that my firm does as well. As you go out and you do a board survey, you talk to board members, you talk to stakeholders and get their perspectives of what's going on. It's sometimes, and it's unfortunate, but it's just human nature. Sometimes we have a different perception of how our actions are versus how they're affecting other people's. And so getting that stakeholder input is really critical.
Yeah, and that's true in any role, any leadership role, I think. And certainly boards and board members are playing a very important leadership role. We also encourage boards to really work closely with their president, chancellor, chief executive, because again, that individual is charged with actually implementing the mission, right, under the guidance of the strategy developed by the boards. And so it's important for those conversations as well to happen. So there are a number of things that I think when those muscles are strong, when there is attempts to influence from the outside. And again, it can be any kind of constituent. You hear those voices at different times in different places. Then there's, I think, more clarity around what the mission is and more of an understanding of how we implement our fiduciary responsibilities, how we communicate strategy with our institutional leader and provide that support. And, at times like today, and having been a president, I noticed the article recently, I think it was in Inside Higher Ed a few weeks ago, about why would anybody be a president today? A lot of presidents are asking that, but this is something for boards to think about as well, because boards actually, bring those presidents on board and have to work with them and support them through these kinds of challenging times. And so the better the board understands its own role and the way it thinks, the perspectives it brings, the strategy it would like to see in terms of implementing the mission, there can be more, I think, level setting of expectations between the board and the senior leadership, and particularly the president, that can lead to, I think, some very healthy and positive outcomes.
Absolutely. I knew this was going to happen. We are at the end of our time. We could go on, and in fact, at some point in time, we probably should talk about that board chair president relationship. I mean, we could dedicate 5 podcasts to that alone. But to just wrap up our typical questions, 3 takeaways for board presidents. I'm sorry, university presidents and boards. I'm getting tongue-tied here.
Well, I would say, well, it's a pleasure, and I'd love to come back and talk to you about the board chair president relationship. It is critical to the success of any institution. So I would say this, the 3 takeaways: that governing boards really have to fall back onto their fiduciary duties. It's very clear on one level, it seems easy, right? Duties of loyalty, care, and obedience. It's often harder than it looks, though, because it really does, ensure that board members have to wrestle with some conflicting, perhaps, pressures. And that's never easy. But we know that that's critical. And so I'd say that's takeaway number 1. Takeaway number 2, board independence is critical to preserving academic freedom, and that is a key component to what makes the American model of higher education the envy of the world. And then third, I would say that being a college president right now is really difficult. There are many challenges of all kinds, and so it's really important for boards to, yes, hold presidents accountable for the expectations, but also provide guidance and provide counsel and to support the president publicly and privately so that together they can navigate whatever challenges they're facing.
Now, those are great takeaways. Thank you, Mary. What's next for you? I mean, you've been at AGB now just a few months, lots of changes going on there as well.
Yeah, well, I would say this. First, I'm really excited to be at AGB. So this has been a wonderful sort of last stop here in my career. I'm thrilled, and especially to be working with our interim president, Ellen Chafee. I'd known Ellen by reputation, but not in person, and I learn from her every day. She's a remarkable leader and is providing great leadership for AGB. So that's really terrific. It's the new year, so I'm excited to see where we can lead AGB over this next year. We will be attending a variety of meetings, including our Foundation Leadership Forum. This is a conference where we bring our institutionally related foundations together. And so that'll be in LA. It's my hometown, so I get to spend a little time with family and friends as well. And then, of course, as we mentioned up front, I'll be in Boston at AGB's National Conference on Trusteeship. And I just had a phone call with a very old friend and mentor who I haven't talked to for a long time, who's based in the Boston area. So while I'm there, I'm going to sneak out and catch up with a mentor of mine who really helped set me on the path to higher education leadership.
That sounds like fun. Well, Mary, thank you so much for being on the show. I look forward to being able to see you again in person in Boston.
Looking forward to it, Drumm. Thank you. And you have a wonderful new year as well.
Thank you very much. You too. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to our guest, Mary Papazian from AGB. Mary, this statement gets to the heart of the issues with governance that are going on in higher ed right now. And thanks to you and all who are involved in putting this statement together. Join us next time when we welcome EdTech expert Phil Hill back to the show. Phil will be joining us to talk about the megatrends in technology impacting higher ed and how they will impact colleges and universities over the next 5 years. Thanks again for listening. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.